this is going to be a fascinating panel. I'm certainly looking forward to it. So Darren, John, thanks very much for your time. John, let me start with you. This is about transition, how we can expedite the transition. I have two questions. What are we transitioning to, and how fast are we going to get there?
Well, it's a little loud. We're transitioning to a world in which we're taking as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we're putting into it. That's the meaning of net zero. Why are we doing that? And I like to hearken back to a report that the world scientists did, the so-called IPCC 1.5 2018 report, that tried to calculate the difference in damage to the natural world, to human society, to the ability of people just to lead decent lives between 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in global average temperatures and a 2 degrees C. And what they found was the level of destruction was so great, they reoriented the world to trying to hit that net zero number. Before that, I worked for President Obama, as you know, David, and we were actually trying to manage to a different number, but the intensity of change, extreme weather on, as I said, not just the natural world, but on human life was so great that we hit a different target. So what they described there was a transformation of the global economy on a size and scale that's never occurred in human history. So that's our task. It's huge. And to get to that point where we're taking as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we're putting into it, we only have a couple of decades to do it.
Well, that's my question about the when. If we're on the current arc, when will we reach that goal of zero net carbon emissions?
You know, look, I think you have to, it's good to set long-term goals, and a lot of corporations have done that, governments have done that. U.S. government has set a net zero goal by 2050. But what's important is to measure in increments where you can be held accountable. And that's why 2030 goals with the policy to back them up and the investments to back them up are so critical. The President, in his early days in office, set a target for the United States of cutting emissions in half by 2030. That's based on, to get technical, on 2005 baseline. But he backed that up with the Inflation Reduction Act and the passage of that, which is the largest investments in clean energy and climate, proofing the economy that's ever occurred, not just in the United States, but in human history.
So Darren, from your point of view, the private sector, if that's the goal, how are we doing?
Well, I agree with John that it's a huge undertaking, one that the planet, frankly, has never tried to address or try to tackle. And I think, frankly, our view is there's a need to do more math in this space. We've got a lot of aspirations and pledges and objectives, but we haven't actually done the hard work of translating those objectives and goals to what it's going to take, how much is it going to cost, how are we going to deploy that around the world. And I think with the IRA and the work that John and the administration has been doing is the first step in really starting to translate across the U.S. economy, achieving carbon reduction objectives through basically any means that meets the carbon intensity specifications that's included in the legislation. So I think it's a good step forward. We're making progress, but the world is way behind. We started off with much too narrow of a solution set that didn't truly comprehend the costs associated and the availability and the ability for the world to actually implement such a narrow solution set. The good news is we're now starting to open the aperture. I think people realize we have to build things. We're going to need companies that have the capabilities to build big projects with big balance sheets. You need companies that not only have expertise in electrons and bringing electron solutions like wind and solar and EVs, but you need companies that know how to manage and transform molecules and can bring the molecule solutions like carbon capture and storage, low carbon hydrogen, and biofuels. And so I think the aperture is open, good work is happening, but the world's got a long, long ways to go.
Well, let's start with the math. I mean, you're an engineer, you deal in math. Is anyone working on that math? When are we going to have the math done? Because it sounds to me, at least, like it's going to be hard to get there if somebody doesn't do the math at some point.
Well, I think there's a couple of different maths that you have to do, and the starting point is we don't have today a system for accounting for carbon. And so if you think about what the world's trying to accomplish in reducing carbon, it feels like a very fundamental first step is to have a good accounting for the carbon in the world and how that carbon is being emitted and produced, and then begin to work the solution set based on that good understanding of the carbon emissions and the carbon accounting. And so that hasn't happened yet. That math's going to be absolutely critical if the world's going to achieve its objectives, and it will allow policymakers to begin to understand what price they're paying for every ton of carbon they're reducing. Today's policy isn't based in a cost-benefit analysis, and given the limited resources that governments around the world have, we got to get to a point where we're able to start prioritizing the highest carbon reduction steps for the lowest possible cost. That's going to require a carbon accounting system. And then the other math that has to be done is just the cost and the ability for the world to actually successfully put the solution in place. The scale of today's global energy system is massive. I don't think people fully comprehend just how big a challenge it will be to replace what's today delivering power and energy around the world and improving people's prosperity, to changing that completely out.
So David, you would be disappointed if we didn't disagree a little bit up here.
Please.
And I've tried to, work with Darren and try to find some places where we have common ground, and in particular in this idea about building large projects that can help decarbonize, particularly industrial processes, marine fuels, aviation fuels, things that are hard to move away from the system we have and into a system that's zero carbon. But I don't think really this is an accounting problem. There's been a lot of analysis done. I think countries, a Paris Agreement, which occurred during President Obama's administration, was such that it understood the scale of the problem. July was the hottest month on record. March was the hottest March on record. Every month in between was the hottest month ever recorded in human history. We're seeing people drowning in Brazil from flash flooding. Extreme weather across the United States. This is going to get worse and worse as the temperature heats up. So the question is, what's the speed and scale with which we're moving to try to move from fossil fuels, which have powered our economy for decades and we're not getting rid of tomorrow, but how do we get to a place where the expertise, the technology, the ability of companies like Darren's can be part of the solution to get us to low carbon solutions? My beef with him is I just think he's not going fast enough.
We'll talk about the face, but before that, I understood, and Darren, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Darren, when it comes to accounting, was making a somewhat different point. It's not sort of globally what's going on with carbon and what's going on with the atmosphere. It was more having a system where we can really measure, company by company, industry by industry, country by country, so that we can really form, ultimately, a carbon market. Back when I was managing things, we used to say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's my experience.
But look, I think we're doing that. The whole system of regulation that backs up the Inflation Reduction Act investments is built around best available technologies that can actually measure emissions. And so whether that's the power sector, the auto sector, the building sector, there's that is the push. We just gotta maybe what we need to do is keep investing in that plan as we go forward, but we got to go fast because the world is really suffering.
Yeah, David, I would just say I wouldn't, and I agree with John, you don't need a carbon accounting system to state the problem. And so it's not about quantifying the magnitude of the problem. It's really around assessing and prioritizing the best steps to take to address the problem. And I would challenge, I think, governments around the world to tell me how much their policy is costing and the benefit that those policies are driving. $1 per ton of CO2 removed. If you take the EV policy in the U.S. and do the math on that, it's roughly $400 per ton of for every ton of CO2 reduced. The IRA gives an incentive for carbon capture of $85 per ton of CO2 reduced. And so in a world that's limited in resources, and all governments are limited in resources, all economies are limited in resources, you want to make sure you have the tools available to prioritize the most effective steps first, and that you're spending the limited resources most effectively. That's the point of the carbon accounting system. And you don't need it to get started. I'm not suggesting that you wait for that, but I am suggesting that if the world's going to get to net zero, you're eventually going to have a system to do that. Might as well get started on it now to facilitate the steps that we already know that we need to take. So it's not a delay game, it's more of something that we need to facilitate getting to a better answer and getting there faster. And I do think you could speed that up if you could more effectively prioritize the solutions, understand what those costs are, and frankly move to a market mechanism, which is your point, David. Governments can't afford to pay for this in perpetuity, and we got to find a way to move to a market-based system. And you're going to need an accounting system to do that. So there's a lot of benefits, I think, to that approach. One of them is not to state the problem or to try to scope the problem. It's much more focused on the solution side.
John, specifically, what about the carbon capture versus EV emissions? Because I've heard this before. Do you agree with that analysis? And are we setting the priorities correctly?
Look, we've changed I think changed the use of the term all of the above from all of the above fuels. We've got to get carbon out of the atmosphere to a solution set that includes carbon capture and sequestration, production of green and blue hydrogen for industrial processes, for taking carbon removal technologies. And we've got tools now, I think, that supports a full suite of current deployment. We've seen massive additional deployment of renewables. Solar, for the first time now in the U.S., was more than 50% of new generation capacity, and globally was more than 50% of new generation capacity, across the world. Last year, there was about $1 trillion of capex spent in the fossil industry, 1.7 in the clean tech industry. So you're seeing the markets move. The question is, what's the pace? And I think the fact that we've got a government-enabled but private sector-led policy is a strength in the United States to create that cycle of investment and innovation that is absolutely necessary to meet these targets. But we've, since the president came into office, there's been $388 billion invested in the clean tech sector, including some by Exxon Mobil.
Right.
So
It's a kind of smaller part. I want to spend more.
I think it's pretty manifest that there has to be a public role and a private role to get to this massive transition. I'm curious about what the respective roles are. What does the government do particularly well? What does it not do particularly well? John, how do you see that? What do you say? The private sector is the right one to do that. The government's the right one to do this.
I think I'll start with the private sector, which is they build projects and they innovate and they drive costs down. And that's absolutely essential in this space. I think what the government does well is sets standards, sets an enabling environment, sets a sense of certainty that if there are going to be incentives coming from the government, as there are in the IRA with built-in incentives to invest clean through the tax code, that those are shaped and clear and move forward. I think what the government does also well is try to calculate the public benefit of that level of investment. What they have increasingly had a hard time do is moving projects, permitting, ensuring that these projects actually kind of go from the drawing board to getting built. And we've tried to tackle that in a way that, this is my third White House. I've never seen this before, to go sector by sector, project by project, and say, is this a project that needs to get done? Transmission, offshore wind, et cetera. What are we going to do to speed the process up and get these projects moving? And I think we've had some real impact on that, but that's something that if the government's dragging you back, then that acceleration by the private sector can't happen.
Darren, something we hear about a lot is permitting. how big an impediment is that to moving faster?
It's absolutely critical. I think any sector or industry in the U.S. today would tell you in order to get projects built, permitting becomes a significant bottleneck to advancing those projects. Beyond that, there's the legal framework that exists that even if you get through the regulatory hurdles, you've got a legal system that then tries to inhibit progress on those investments. So it is a challenge to get things built, but I agree with John on the points that he's made around the role of government in terms of representing the will of the people, translating that will into legislation and then policy and regulation, which has been happening with the IRA. And I think the work that they've been doing to try to facilitate the permitting and to make sure that the objectives that the administration is working for on behalf of the American people, and frankly that I think companies like Exxon Mobil can contribute to, are actually being built effectively. And that's been, I think, an area where John and I have spent a lot of time talking as a business person who can bring technology to the solution, who can bring project capabilities, and can do things at scale. I think we've got a perspective to help inform the policymakers on how best to achieve that so that we can make the advance that the administration is looking for and that the American people want.
I think what John was asking in part was, why aren't you doing it faster? I mean, what are the impediments? And I'm not even necessarily saying just Exxon Mobil, but in general, the private sector. Why is it not moving faster than it is?
Well, I think, one of the challenges in this space is striking the right balance. And I think, John's talked about this before, and the government has a role to strike a balance in advancing emissions reductions while continuing to meet the needs of society, provide cheap and affordable, reliable supplies of energy that sustain economic growth in people's lifestyles. And you have to strike a balance there. As a company, we have to strike a balance between working to provide that and develop and delivering a return for shareholders. The reality is there's no market here today. There's no market for carbon reduction. So if you look at the work that we're doing in low carbon hydrogen, in carbon capture and storage, we're actually building brand new businesses and brand new value chains from end to end. There aren't too many companies actually engaged in this that can work the business from the front end, which is capturing the CO2 at a emitter site, and then transport that, get it to a sequestration site, and then have the technology to effectively and permanently store that underground. We're uniquely positioned to do that, but it is an end-to-end value chain that frankly we're creating from scratch. And I think that's part of the issue and the time that it's taking. And with respect to moving faster, even today the IRA has not been translated into regulation. And so the certainty and the incentives for investing in this space are still being developed and formed. And so as a business, we've got to understand what are the implications for the investments, what are the returns for our shareholders, making sure it's competitive in our portfolio. I think the way the legislation has been written and the intent of that legislation, we believe we can come up with a solution that's win-win, that advances significant emissions reductions and delivers a return for our shareholders. And that's what we're working on. But it will take time to build brand new businesses, particularly at the scale that's required to move the needle in this space.
I think what I heard is it's back to you on regulations under
No,
IRA.
I didn't. We both have a job here.
I think, we have had an ongoing conversation about, particularly on there's a tax credit for clean hydrogen that's been particularly tricky. And we issued some preliminary guidance, and we're taking a lot of input, and we're going to put out additional guidance on it. But for the most part, we've gone with record speed to get the guidance out. We just updated our guidance on sustainable aviation fuel. I think that was well received, and we'll move the market. There, in the clean power sector, the full complement of rules are out there. We're tweaking one fairly soon to take care of some problems in the marketplace that we didn't foresee. Maybe others did, and that'll happen, in the next couple of weeks. But I think that what we're seeing is that tremendous amount of deployment. Electric vehicles have quadrupled since President Biden came into office. I talked about the significance of the solar deployments that we're seeing in the United States. The bill was structured in a way that was intended to provide the direct benefits to the communities that have often suffered from power plant and industrial pollution, to give bonuses to people who will go and invest in traditional energy communities. places that have powered the country for decades, and to pay a decent wage through giving a bonus again for paying prevailing wage, to stimulate the workforce by giving, again, the certainty that if you use registered apprentices, create good career paths for people, you'll be rewarded for that as a good actor, private company. So that's a lot to get done in a fairly short amount of time, and the market, as I noted, is truly responding to that across that full range of technologies. And I haven't even talked about agriculture and forestry, and some of the other places. This is an attack on every emitting sector to try to provide the push and the incentive to get better solutions.
Darren, you talked about end-to-end businesses that you're building, and I know you're in carbon capture, you're doing hydrogen. Of the ones you're working on right now, you have some experience with, what are the most promising?
I think they all have promise. The challenge will be how quickly will the market, not government policy, but the market develop to support the rollout of those products. And so carbon capture and storage is one that John and the IRA are incentivizing and try to catalyze, and the challenge will be to move that to market forces. Low carbon hydrogen is similarly needs today government subsidy to compete with gray hydrogen or existing hydrogen production. How quickly will the market begin to pay a premium for those investments? That's going to be critical. Some of the things that we're working in that may surprise folks is, we're getting into the lithium business, using our existing ability to drill and process brine water to extract lithium. That's a market that already exists today and a product that's being developed and sold. And so there are a lot of promise in that space for us to bring on a much more environmentally friendly source of lithium at a much lower cost. We're also looking at converting carbon molecules that are in some of our facilities into products that go into batteries. And so there's a lot of technology opportunities out there in the molecule space to take the hydrogen carbon molecule and make products that the world needs. I have a lot of optimism about that technology delivering these products and delivering it into markets that are willing to pay for it. But if I could just make one more point to follow up or to extend the point that John was making. I mean, the U.S. needs to set an example for the world in terms of how to best address driving the economy and enlisting market forces to reduce emissions, because the global problem in reaching net zero won't be solved by the U.S. in isolation. I mean, the challenge will be getting a system that works for around the world and takes into account the circumstances as you move around the world of different communities and societies. And so coming up with a platform, demonstrating a way to make this happen so that we can start more effectively addressing that and engaging the business sector and the private sector is going to be critical to addressing the emissions, which frankly are growing more rapidly outside of Western countries. And that to me is the real challenge of bringing down that cost to make sure that people today who are living in energy poverty, who don't have the same economic capacity that many of us do here in the West, that we allow that prosperity to grow, their economic well-being to grow, while at the same time reducing their emissions. That's a huge challenge, that we get too overly focused on the Western world, lose sight of this developing world or the South that have a long ways to go on just growing their economic capacity.
Darren, ExxonMobil's been in the news because of the Pioneer acquisition recently. A lot about who's going to be on the board, not going to be on the board, things like that. But how does that fit into ExxonMobil's overall strategy, the acquisition of Pioneer, to address climate issues?
So one of the things, the unconventional business, the shale oil, is a relatively new resource development in the kind of the timeline of the history of the oil and gas business. And frankly, the technology employed in that is fairly early on the curve. One of the things that we did as we got into the unconventional business is challenge our technology organization to more effectively unlock those resources. Today, the industry's recovering very little of the oil that's in place because of the technical challenges associated with unlocking that resource. We've done a lot of work in how we develop the fields and the technologies that we deploy to more effectively recover the resource. So with Pioneer that have premium acreage, we're bringing a unique set of technologies and development capabilities to a very attractive set of acreage. So we will produce more oil at a lower cost, which is good for the economy, it's good for consumers, and we'll do it in a more environmentally friendly way. In fact, Pioneer had a 2050 net zero pledge or aspiration. We've committed to make that a 2035 plan to get to net zero. Our existing Permian business, we're getting to net zero by 2030. We've got a clear plan on how we're going to do that, and we're going to fold the Pioneer into that, so it'll be good for the environment as well. So from our perspective, we're leveraging core capabilities that we've developed in ExxonMobil and applying it to a broader set of opportunities, which will be win-win-win for the U.S., the consumers in the U.S., and then for the environment.
John, one thing we haven't talked about is trade. I saw a speech you recently gave actually about trade. I think what you said is if you took trade as a country,
Tradable goods.
it would be it would be the second largest producer of carbon emissions in the world
behind the PRC.
after China. Exactly right. Give us your view on trade and what it's doing with respect to our climate efforts. And by the way, some of it also is ability to import inexpensive green products from China, right? Whether it's solar panels or EVs.
Well, look, we need to update, I think, global policy to incentivize a race to the top. What we have now is a system that does pretty well at producing low-cost goods, but it doesn't account for the embodied carbon that's in those goods. So we pay a lot of attention to marine shipping, air shipping, et cetera, and the fuels that are used to move those goods, but we need to pay attention to the carbon profile of the goods themselves, particularly in heavy embodied carbon products like steel, aluminum, cement. And I think that the lowest cost doesn't account for essentially the cost to the planet and the cost to society from production that is emitting a lot of carbon. That's particularly a problem in China, where they still have this huge investment and growing in coal-fired power. So, I noted that in the speech as well. Europe is kind of in the lead on this. They're creating a carbon border adjustment mechanism to protect their industrial base from being undercut by imports that don't have to account for the price of carbon. We have a different mix of policies. We need to integrate a whole series of policy efforts, but now I'm going to come back and agree with Darren. I promised myself I wouldn't do that. This is a place where we do need better accounting.
I was going to say, don't you need accountability to do that?
We do need better accounting. Yeah. We need to know what that carbon load that was used to create that product, whether it's a slab of steel, aluminum, some concrete, etc., in order to properly adjust and value the cleaner and not benefit the dirtier sources of those materials.
So in a nutshell, why don't we have a carbon border adjustment tax? Because at one point I thought President Biden was walking right up to that line. It sounded like that's where he was going. Why don't we have it?
Look, we're engaged with conversations on Capitol Hill. There are a bunch of different ideas floating out there. We're in the process of doing what I just said, which is to update and improve the information stock so that we know exactly what we're measuring. And I think by we'll use the remainder of this session of Congress to have those conversations, but we definitely need policy in this area, and we'll move forward and probably in the second Biden administration propose some.
So, Darren, well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to take advantage of the fact that John agreed with me to make another point about the carbon accounting. I think if you get the carbon accounting system in place, you can avoid the need for a carbon border adjustment, which I think, frankly, is going to be an administrative nightmare for countries all around the world and businesses conducting that. If you have a carbon accounting system, you can put carbon intensity specifications on products, use existing protocols that are in place rather than inventing brand new systems that create trade barriers. So I think the carbon accounting mechanism has huge benefits across a very wide swath of challenges that are required to be faced and overcome in reducing emissions.
By the way, I know we're wrapping, but the other big challenge is we got to break our over-dependency on China for these supply chains and the clean technologies. They've massively invested in this. They've sometimes unfairly supported their industry, and this is a huge challenge to bring the supply chains home, invest in with both in the U.S. and amongst our friends to make sure the green future is built in America.
And we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, John Podesta and Darren Woods. It was terrific. Great to talk with you.